Greetings. Let me begin with two African proverbs and a verse of scripture. When the roots of a tree begin to decay, it spreads death to the branches. From Nigeria. Where you will sit when you are old shows where you stood in youth. From the Yoruba tradition. And from the book of Proverbs 22:6 we read, "Train up a child in the way he should go, and when he is old, he will not depart from it." Now, in just over 2 weeks' time, on Saturday, the 22nd, Friday, just under 2 weeks' time, on Friday, the 22nd of June, across Britain, we will mark the 70th anniversary of the arrival of the Empire Windrush at Tilbury Docks, London, on the 22nd of June, 1948. The official number on board was said to be 492, but we know that there were over 500, mainly Jamaicans, on board that ship. And they were responding, as can be pointed out a while ago, to a call to help to rebuild Britain after World War II. And they were being pushed by their own challenging economic circumstances. Those that paid, there are always those who slip in without paying, paid their £28 and 10 shillings. Current value varies between £600 and, as we heard a while ago, £1,000 today. Arthur Creech Jones, colonial secretary in the Labour government at the time, responded to the tide of concern that swept across the political landscape at the prospect of so many black people coming to darken the fair land of Britain, by telling his political colleagues who were minded to send the ship and its cargo back from whence they came, he said, "These people have British passports." Where have we heard that before? "And they must be allowed to land," adding, he said, that they would not last one winter in England anyway, so there was nothing to worry about. 70 years on, my friends, and the words of Mayor Angelo rings out, and still we rise. The Empire Windrush was not, of course, the first or the last ship to bring people from Africa and the Caribbean to British shores. Before and during the age of the airplane that brought many of us, and I still recall my BOAC landing on a bleak autumnal morning at Heathrow Airport back in 1968. How long Africans lived in Britain is demonstrated by the historic site of Hadrian's Wall in the north of England, part of the Roman province of Britannia 2,000 years ago. It is known to have had a 500-strong unit of Moors, Queen called them blackamoors, stationed near the town of Carlisle in the 3rd century. And they may well have been involved in the building of the wall in the 2nd century. For centuries, during the sad and murderous 2nd millennia AD, the European transatlantic slave trade and plantation slavery, followed by colonialism and now some argue neo-colonialism, the blood, sweat, and tears became part of the foundation upon which this country has been built. Thousands of African and Caribbean servicemen and some women, many paying the ultimate sacrifice with their lives in World War I and World War II. Some survivors also stayed right here in Britain to make it their home. And we, brothers and sisters, no matter what the racists tell us, are no Johnny-come-lately. Windrush is part of a continuing story, not the beginning of that story. But who could have guessed that those brave, pioneering young people, with hope and determination in their souls and their grips in their hands, stepping off the Empire Windrush in 1948, that they and us would be marking the 70th anniversary of that moment in 2018. Mike and Trevor Phillips, in their book, a bit old now, Windrush, The Irresistible Rise of Multicultural Britain, they say to us that black people faced what they call a mixed reception in Britain. A mixed reception in which glimpses of the Christian country that they expected to find were buried under racist attitudes, words, and actions. You don't easily forget how suddenly vacancy as a sign became no vacancy. How rooms to let signs quickly became no Irish, no blacks, no dogs. And if you dared to attend church and felt the cold attitude of the worshippers shuffling up the bench as you sat next to them, that might well have been followed by the vicar whispering in your ear as you left the church without a handshake. We'd prefer if you didn't come back. That's right. Your people meet down the road. That's right. But the Phillips brothers again remind us that most of the early Windrush people, most of them thought that they would be back in Jamaica predominantly in a few years, with money in their pockets. The 5-year syndrome, as it is known. And so our pioneers largely adopted a grin and bear it attitude. They worked hard, looked after family here and home, worshipped their gods, and kept hope alive. And yes, there were times when the response to racist hostility spilled over into angry confrontation, even riots, or uprisings, as my friends call it. Now, it is easy to forget that 1948 was a mere 114 years since the abolition of slavery in the British colonies. By the time the Windrush generation started coming to Britain, our social and cultural norms were not normal. Violently removed from Africa, social and cultural practices beaten out of us, in the face of stubborn resistance, including death. White hegemony held up as the norm. We were a people out of love with ourselves and desperately trying to please our oppressors. As Frantz Fanon so well illustrates in Black Skin, White Mask, we were a people in socio-cultural formation, trying to make sense of the racialized polyglots of cultures in the Caribbean, often seeing, emulating whiteness as the way forward. Nowhere is this sociocultural complexity more evident than in the area of faith. Here in Jesus, we find a figure with whom we easily identify because of the similarity between our recent history of suffering and the suffering of Jesus. But scratch beneath the surface, and the Jesus that many black people identified with was a white European man who resembled Michelangelo. We need to redeem the image of Jesus in our minds, as the late James Cone told us when he asserted, Jesus is black. The Windrush travelers' grandfathers and grandmothers had not long been turned off the plantations in the Caribbean penniless, while their oppressors were compensated for loss of property to the tune of £20 million, said to be some £20 billion in today's money. Not every black person is poor, of course, but as a people, internationally, nationally, and in communities, we have not yet come out of the economic wilderness with all the consequences of group poverty. And when the Windrush docked in 1948, the politics of those who disembarked were rooted in being a colonized people with little or no influence on the system that ruled over us. So unused were they to existing adult suffrage and exercising that suffrage that we have tended to vote for whichever party seems to offer us the most promise. And the Labour Party has become our adopted political home and the home of the majority of the Windrush generation, so much so that the party can afford to take our vote for granted because black people vote Labour. Politics, for most of us, remains, though, a dirty word. And yet politics exercise so much control over the quality of our lives. So now, 70 years since the docking of the Empire Windrush takes us to 184 years since the abolition of slavery in the West Indies. This means that we, the descendants of Africans in the Caribbean, have spent a significant 40% of the post-slavery period living in this country. That's a chunk. But this is a short time in the evolution of a people. We are still working out our cultural, economic, and political identity. We are a people still in transition, trying to sing the Lord's song in a strange land. The black church movement in Britain is unquestionably one of the standout success of black life in Britain during the past 70 years. From a standing start, when British mainstream churches and their leaders called our churches sects, their pioneering leaders and congregations worked in the challenging context I've been describing, showing resolve, vision, and a commitment to the spiritual, social, economic, and political improvement of their community and society at large. Today, the presence and influence of the black church is pervasive. Were Marcus Garvey alive, he would approve of the sense of self-determination and belief in the sanctity of the self, made in God's image and likeness, that has allowed black Christians in often hostile environment to keep on keeping on. 70 years from now, in 2088, not many, if any of us, here this morning will still be alive. But what might the Windrush generation in Britain look like then? I close with 3 quick suppositions that could inspire us and our children and grandchildren in the coming 70 years. If the roots of a tree spread its essence to its branches, if it is possible to tell where you will sit in old age by where you stood in your youth, and if the training of a child receives now will not desert them when they are old, then we better take stock of where we have come from, where we are today, and where we are going. I believe the church has a key role to play in helping us to get there, to a good future. First, we need to commit to the restoration of the family. One of the biggest casualties of capture, enslavement, and colonialism was the family that was torn apart and kept apart. I encourage you to read the slave narratives. Healing of family starts with the healing of self, of loving of self, love of the black self, then love of the black family, love of the black community, love of Africa and African things. As Maccabee, the Wolverhampton reggae singer, says, for a black Caribbean to say they're not African is like a scallion saying it's not an onion. My friends, only when you truly love self can you love others. Let's do what is necessary to restore family as the bedrock of a good society. Every boy that leaves home with a knife, every boy that shoots a gun belongs to a family and belongs to a community. Every young man contorting himself to walk in saggy pants with their backsides out a door belong to a family and belong to a home. And come out of a home dressed, let them batter their door. We need to sit down together, eat together, pray together, talk together, to carve out our future together as families. My second point is, more of us need to get out of poverty. It is because so many of us are still poor and disproportionately living in deprived, crime-ridden areas that so many of our children are harassed by the police. Getting out of poverty requires us to ensure our community gets good education, that we are ambitious in terms of the professions and the jobs, and are not afraid of entrepreneurship, not afraid to save and invest. In short, we need to learn what our parents knew. You need to spend less than you earn. Third and final, we should strive to see ourselves proportionately represented in the political setup of the cities and the country in which we live. By this I mean, if we Caribbean Windrush people are 3% of the national population, we should ensure that we are 3% of the political representation. So, for example, if there are 650 MPs in Parliament, as there are about, there should be 20 Windrush generation MPs in Parliament. But is we have to do it? We can shout at the government as much as we like, but the leopard will never change its spot, nor the Ethiopian his skin. It is we who have to do it. We should ensure we register to vote. We should ensure that we vote. And we should ensure that we run for elected office, as our friend sitting here, Desmond Jadu, did the other day. Not the only one, of course. We should strive for similar representation in all strata of society, the professions and civic offices. And if our churches see ourselves as God's agency for the salvation of the people of God, then churches must be less self-serving, willing to collaborate, even merge where necessary, forge strategic ecumenical partnerships to leverage its people and our wider community into a social, economic, and political system that is often outside of the gamut of our people in this class-ridden old boys network of a society. Friends, in closing, there you have it. My manifesto for the next 70 years. Building on the legacy of the Windrush generation of the past 70 years. And I end with this stark warning. racism isn't going anywhere anytime soon. So we have to learn to live in a culture where racism exists. Evil isn't going anywhere anytime soon, but we have to learn to do good in that very place. And we have to learn how we become stronger, that we may be stronger than the racist and their endeavors. I thank you.